Good evening, everyone. My name is Lou Pizzatola. Thank you for joining us tonight. In his new book, Drunk Tank Pink, Adam Alter, an assistant professor at the Stern School of Business, explores the forces that shape our thoughts and actions. Our lives, our guest argues, are influenced by large forces for sure, but also by the seemingly banal, such as what happens to us in the presence of the color pink, which I decided not to wear tonight because I wanted you to all stay awake. He also talks about what creative juices start to flow when we see a light bulb, and what subconscious attractions the first letter in our first name might produce. The details and insights in Drunk Tank Pink are not only a pleasure to read, they may actually change the way you look at the world. And joining Adam tonight is a writer who has changed our perception as well with his writings. He is a journalist and the best-selling author of The Tipping Point, Blink, and Outliers, among others. Please join me in welcoming Adam Alter, author of Drunk Tank Pink, and Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
we thought we would just chat a bit about Adam's wonderful new book, and then we'll have questions after a while. But I wanted to do this because I think this is a really wonderful book, a thought-provoking book, and in some cases, a disturbing book. And we're not going to, I don't think we should try and summarize it now, but I wanted to bring up one or two, after you've given us a little bit more understanding of the book, I wanted to bring up one or two larger issues I think come out of the book that are worth keeping in mind if you're going to read it. But why don't you start, Adam? Tell us about Drunk Tank Pink.
Sure, so Drunk Tank Pink is a color. It's a pink color, and it's called Drunk Tank Pink because psychologists used it to paint the inside of jail cells, drunk tanks. And they found in the late 70s and early 80s that when they painted these cells Drunk Tank Pink, that people were much calmer after they emerged from the cells. And the effect gained a lot of currency in the early 80s and the mid 80s, and it started to be used in all sorts of different settings. Football coaches started to paint the visiting locker rooms the same color to try and pacify their opposition. And after a while, people started to question whether the effect was real, what was happening. There was a lot of very careful research done looking at why the effect emerged, when it disappeared, what led the effect to come out strongly, what made it weaker. And I thought it was a nice emblem for the book because it came out of nowhere. People could not believe that it had all the effects that it seemed to have, and that's true of so many of the effects that I talk about.
Wait, so what do we know about why, first of all, you think the effect is real, do you?
I think it might be real. I think the reason why it emerges is maybe not exactly what some of the people who argue for it think. So one possibility is that it's physiological, that there's something about this color. When it hits our retinas, it then interacts with the brain, it produces certain hormones. That's one of the arguments. One piece of evidence in favor for that is that even colorblind people, and I'm colorblind, even we are supposed to show this effect. And there's a little bit of evidence for that. But there's a lot more evidence that suggests that a lot of what's going on is this expectation, that we have an association between the color pink and certain traits, certain kinds of behaviors. And we think of pink as being a sign of weakness, and therefore when we see pink, that weaker behavior comes out. And so we act in a more pacified or relaxed way. I tend to err on that side. I don't think it's primarily physiological. I find that very hard to believe. And I think it's largely about the association. But given that, I do think there's something there.
Yeah. Probably some mixture. Is that because I was curious, you start the book with that, and then the book consists of you looking at one example after another of versions of this phenomenon, of ways in which we are being profoundly influenced by things in our environment. And I'm curious whether those do most of the other things you talk about fit that same pattern, that they have some mixture or some unknown and some mixture of physiological and kind of psychological origins.
Yeah, I think a lot of the effects are based on association. So that we associate whatever that cue is with some outcome or some other concept, and then that influences us in a way that's congruent with that. A lot of the effects are also biological or physiological. So the weather is a good example. People argue that the color red is a combination. So when we see people wearing red, or when we see someone with a flushed red face, we imagine that they're sexually interested. And so that leads us to be more attracted to them. So if you have someone on a dating website changing the color of their shirt, but otherwise with an identical photo across time, they'll attract many more hits on the dating website when they wear red than any of the other colors. So the argument there is that that red reminds you of the flush of blood that comes to someone's face when they're interested, but you associate that then with their being interested. So there's a physiological component as well.
I was curious of all of the, so you give on one of the kind of great things about the book is just how many different corners of the world you explore with this idea. I'm curious, which of all of the variety of versions of this effect do you find the most striking, unexpected? Is there one that kind of has always stuck in your head?
There are a few that really strike me. It's like asking me to choose among my children, because I love these effects like they're my children. And I think...
You don't actually have children.
I don't have children. I don't have children, but I have 9... It's not, but I have 9 chapters, and each chapter is a baby.
But in the intro, I am talking with an academic. I thought we should be specific about these effects.
You're right, yeah, that's...
So you were doing an imaginary effect.
I was. I think some of the reason I hesitate is because some of my favorite effects are name related, and I've done a lot of research on names. So we found that people rise up the legal hierarchy in a law firm more quickly when you can pronounce their names more easily. We found that when you release a stock on the stock market, the ones that have names that are pronounceable or easy to pronounce tend to do better in the first week of trading. The reason I hesitate, I think these effects are fascinating, but there are some other name effects that recently have received a lot of attention in psychology, and people question whether they're real. So I'm a little bit concerned about just focusing on the name effects. If we go to the other end of the spectrum, those are the very narrow effects, the small cues that reside in our heads. That's the way I put it in the book. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are big cues, very big physical cues that are all surrounding. And I think the effects of nature on behavior, cognition, on how we feel and think and react to all sorts of stresses, I think those effects are phenomenal, profound, and very powerful. And I think they are very robust.
Yeah.
So if people undergo stress, for example, putting them in a natural environment reduces the impact of that stress in profound ways.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the name effects for a moment. The name effects that have recently been called into question are what?
There's an effect known as implicit egotism or implicit egoism. And the idea is that we are so deeply attracted to our names that if you have a name that begins with L, you are more likely to become a lawyer. And if you happen to be named Florence, there's a greater likelihood that you'll live in Florida than any other state, or that'll bump up the likelihood that you live in Florida. And it's the same with Carolina and so on. And it's supposed to be pervasive. It's supposed to affect all sorts of decisions, from where we live to the jobs we have. I think some of those effects are shaky. There's a psychologist and a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, Uri Simonson, who's done some great research showing that some of these are a little bit shaky, or showing that there are other explanations for the effects that are perhaps more compelling. So I think some of the effects are real, and he acknowledges that, and he says some others seem to be driven by confounds.
Now, the one of the questions I had from the book was when you go through these various ways in which we're being influenced by our environment in ways that may not be apparent to us. Sometimes I felt like you were discussing things that were universal to all human beings, and sometimes I thought, oh, this sounds like it could be quite culturally specific. You have a section on culture, but for example, the red stuff sounds like that works everywhere.
Yeah.
But I was curious, are there a number of them that would be strikingly true here, but not, say, in the East, or?
I think some of them are true where the association holds. So some of the symbol effects that I talk about, or symbolic effects in early on in the book, I talk about how certain symbols are associated with certain things. So those effects are obviously culture bound. And if you move outside the culture, or where the symbol has a different meaning, you'll find that the effect disappears altogether. A lot of the effects are universal, though. You're right, there's a culture chapter where I talk about differences across cultures, and I actually talk about culture as one of these cues that shapes our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors. But I think most of the effects, a lot of them, are quite universal.
Yeah. Now, why? Here's a kind of a dumb question, but it's one I always come back to, which is the as you go through chapter to chapter of the book, and you present evidence, one piece of evidence after another, of ways in which our cues in our environment are affecting us, the way we behave. And each time I say to myself as I read them, wow, I didn't know that, right? Now, why don't I know that? So why isn't it obvious to us that we would be profoundly affected by cues in our environment? Why wouldn't we say, oh, that person's wearing red? Of course, that's why, I have the hots for her. Why do these things, why do they always come as a surprise?
I think the feedback we get is so murky and so noisy that we get feedback that just doesn't correspond to the nature of the effect. So when you like someone, one thing we do is we fabricate reasons all the time. So there's a classic study where people looked at a row of pantyhose, and this was done I think in the 60s, and they were asked, which one of these pantyhose do you like the most? And we have a strange preference to prefer sometimes the first thing we look at, sometimes the last thing. But when you ask people, they almost always chose the pair on the right. When you ask them, they say, I like the one on the right because it's a little more sheer, it seems like it's a little stretchier, it's exactly what I'm looking for in a pair of pantyhose. But they were all the same pair. There was no difference. Well, that sheer is what I'm looking for in pantyhose.
No, I was questioning whether you were in fact looking for sheer in pantyhose, but go on.
Yeah. So these are all the same pair. So people are fabricating after the fact these explanations for why they like that pair. So we're very good at doing that after the fact. And often the explanations or the real forces driving our feelings and our thoughts, the ones that I talk about in the book, are not as obvious, and therefore over the top, we layer over that our own explanations that seem more compelling to us. Mm-hmm. And because the feedback is so noisy, we can do that. And we never ever get correction from the environment.
But so here's an example where I had this question, which is, there's this really fascinating part where you're talking about how the language that's used to describe events affects our memory. So this was the one about the with cars.
The car, yeah.
So wait, tell us that for a minute, and then I'll come back to my question.
Yeah, this is a classic effect in legal testimony, in the psychology of legal testimony and eyewitness memory. So people watch a video and they watch a car colliding with another car, or I think there are a number of versions. In one version, the car is colliding with another car. And they're asked all sorts of questions about it after the fact, and that collision is described with different terms. And some of the terms make it sound like it was faster than other terms. So sometimes they're asked, when the car collided with the other car, how fast was it going? At other times they're asked, when the car smashed the other car, how fast was it going? And there are a whole lot of different words. I think there are 5 or 6 variations. Contact was the lightest, the most gentle. It's like the two cars just had a peck on the cheek. And people, when they remember that event, based on the word used, will remember that the cars were going at different speeds. So their estimates of how fast the cars were going are driven by these different words.
And also whether there was glass broken.
And whether there was glass broken, which is critical for eyewitness testimony. Because obviously when people are remembering the event, if you are trying to sway them as an advocate, you may want them to remember that, or you may want them not to remember that. And you can sway their memory, you can twist their memory.
So, but this is where I had the question. So why don't we, when people direct us to remember an event, when they say, how fast were the cars going when the cars collided or smashed into each other, why don't we say, wait a minute, don't prejudice my response, use a neutral word? I mean, why isn't that the first thing that comes to mind? I mean, it seems to me really obvious that we know the word smashed into is loaded, right?
Right.
So why don't we call attention, and why isn't it obvious to us that the use of that kind of loaded language is something that we ought to be protected from?
It's a big question in psychology, whether you react against what's being shown to you or whether you assimilate it with your memory. Mm-hmm. And I think often the memory is sufficiently malleable or unclear to you that you are happy to take on that baggage, that new piece of information, and it doesn't sound so egregiously different from what you saw that you say, hang on, that's not right, I'm being swayed here, I'm being manipulated. If you do feel that, then you will get a rebound effect. And so if you do, in the very rare case where you feel that someone is manipulating you, and a courtroom is actually a good place where this does happen sometimes, people are more aware of that, and if you're railing against an argument and you're facing cross-examination, you obviously will get angry if you feel that's happening. But very often, I think there's enough murkiness that instead of railing against it, you take it on board and it just becomes a part of that memory.
Yeah. You mentioned courtrooms, and this is a good place to kind of um, to remark on what's sort of disturbing or subversive about the book, which is that's one of, so if we think about all of the ways in which our judgments can be impaired by these environmental cues. So we've mentioned one, the language that's used to direct us to an event. You also spend some portion of the book talking about racial effects as well, the inferences that we draw from someone's race without really meaning to. When you start to add, and you have a number of these in the book, when you add them all up, you have to ask yourself, well, is a fair trial as we currently conduct them possible?
Based on the way the world works now,
Yeah.
and based on your definition, what I assume your definition of fairness is, I don't really think so. I think some of the conclusions that you have to draw from some of the studies is no, based on the way the world works. And I think the clearest example of this is there are studies that show that if you look at people who've committed very grave crimes and you look at African American defendants, you can classify their faces according to how typically African American or black they look. And what you find is that the more typically African American they look, the more likely they are to receive the death penalty for exactly the same crime. The only difference here in those cases is the way their faces look.
Yeah.
It's hard to argue that that's fair and that there's a way to overcome that because people have no idea that they're doing that. I should say this is only when there's a white victim, which is perhaps even more disturbing.
Yeah.
But the fact that this is true and that people don't know they're doing it, that they're being swayed, suggests that it's incredibly difficult to overcome these effects.
Is there no dialogue between social psychologists and people in the legal profession over these kinds of effects?
There's plenty of dialogue. They have a lot of discussions about it. I just think it's not really clear how you can undo some of the effects. So we talk a lot about this, the nature of discounting. So what we try to do when we have these pieces of information is discount them. And you want to basically be able to chop them out from any of the judgments we're making, cast them aside, and then make the judgment as though that piece of information that's biasing you is no longer present. It's not infecting your judgment anymore. But often the lines are so blurry that you can't just cut them out. You can't excise them completely.
But wait a minute. There are some things I've always wondered about this. Given just the thing that you were talking about, the disparity in sentences between blacks and whites for the same offense, isn't the logical answer to that that the defendant in a trial should never be seen? I've never understood this. Why does the jury have to see the defendant? And all the reasons people give me are so bogus. Well, I need to see them because I need to judge whether they're lying or not. Well, everything we know from social psychology says you can't tell whether they're lying or not. So it's all more of the same. It's people's they continually want to claim that they're better at making social judgments than they actually are. So why not just take the person out of the room?
I think that's pretty compelling. So you talk about that in Blink a little bit about having people when they're auditioning for an orchestra be behind a curtain rather than visible. I talk about it a little bit or think about it a little bit in the domain of chess. It's a strange domain to talk about it. But there's some evidence that if you play chess, if you're a heterosexual male and you're playing chess against a very attractive female opponent, you'll make many riskier moves. You end up losing more often. And this has been shown in a long analysis, a long-term analysis, long-ranging looking at lots of games played by chess grandmasters. So the very most rational, brilliant, expert chess players are falling prey to this bias. I think in a lot of domains, we could remove these effects by removing the image, which is causing the effects. So if you play chess effectively as though you were playing against a computer, you don't really have an opponent, you just see the moves being made. That would remove that part of the effect. But then, of course, knowing the way people have played in the past, so this doesn't apply to the legal domain, but in chess it helps to know who you're playing against, to know what moves they've made in the past, as with any sport, with tennis, with any game like that.
Yeah.
So you don't want to remove that. Maybe you could know who you're playing against without actually seeing them.
Yeah. But some of these effects that you've been talking about have been known for some time, and yet it is astonishing how little impact our knowledge of these effects has made on the way the real world operates. Why is that?
I think sometimes the link between the effect, understanding that the effect exists and knowing what to do is critical. So one of the things I've talked about is we know that when people donate to hurricane aid after a hurricane, this is one of the name effects that is apparently, even Uri seems to think this one's real, that when you donate to a hurricane, you are likely to donate about 50% more if the hurricane happens to share your initial. So for Hurricane Katrina, Kevins and Kens and Kims donated much more than they did for Hurricane Mitch, and Marty's and Malcolm's donated much more for Mitch than Katrina. The question is, what do we do with this? It's kind of fascinating. Well, one thing we could do is we could change the way we name hurricanes. So if you look at the hurricane lists, every year they have 6 different lists for the Atlantic hurricane season. They've been using them since the 50s. And they cycle down the list from A to, I think the last letter might be a V or a W. And they go down the list and they pick these hurricanes. And it's done because it's convenient. You don't want to have to refer to longitude and latitude. What we could do, though, is look at the demographic makeup of the US and the names and find that maybe the wealthiest people happen to have names that begin with a certain initial, or that there are many more people with M names and A names and J names, and therefore we should name more of our hurricanes M, A, and J names. And
I would think that we'd want to name all our hurricanes B and G for Buffett and Gates.
Buffett and Gates. Or you can do that. Or we could just pick one. Every hurricane is Hurricane Gates. Hurricane Gates the 7th.
Bobby Gates. The other question I had was, so there's that, and that's sort of a, it's always puzzling, this kind of, it's what sort of, the more you get engaged in social psychology, the more frustrating the world becomes, because it fails to sort of live up to your, but the other part of this is, and you touch on this, there's a section, a paragraph that you talk about, in which you talk about this on the end of your book, and I want to read 2 sentences of it. And you're sort of thinking about all the work that you've described, and you say, these studies tell us something profound and perhaps a bit disturbing about what makes us who we are. There isn't a single version of you. When you're surrounded by litter, you're more likely to be a litter bug. When you're walking past buildings with broken windows, you're more likely to disrespect the property that surrounds you, on and on and on. That notion that there isn't a single version of you is the most subversive thing in the book, because, and it's the thing that we cling to. How many conversations have all of us had in which we talked about what the kind of person that we are, right? But in fact, what you're saying is, if you properly take into account these environmental influences, it becomes very hard to know the kind of person that you are.
Yeah, I think there's an anchor, and so we have. You can say that this person is different from this other person in certain ways. I think what happens, though, is we deviate from that anchor depending on what's going on around us. So there is no single version of you, but you will be different from someone else. It's not like everyone in the presence of litter becomes that same person. I think you will have an anchor and then you deviate from the anchor. But I think that's the most radical and extreme version of social psychology. It's the suggestion that your surroundings, the situation, is everything. And without the situation, you are effectively, it's impossible to say what kind of a person you are. Yeah. You could never perceive a person in a vacuum. You put them in a vacuum in space somewhere where there's nothing to see. Of course, I show that even the color black, which you'd see in space, affects you. So it's very hard to imagine a situation where you're totally unaffected. But these situational effects are so powerful that at their extreme, you are no one until you know what that situation is doing to you.
Yeah. But that's
it is disturbing.
That's the sort of the ultimate fiction of our lives, right? That we spend an awful lot of time creating a sort of mythological identity for ourselves that's in defiance of the facts.
Yeah, it's a very strong way of putting it, because that, I think, denies that anchor. I think that anchor is real and it's very important. But I think what we don't recognize is how far we deviate from the anchor. So it's not like we are just sort of doing a little dance around the anchor. In the right setting, we are completely different people. People can't believe that they'll react in certain ways when they read about certain experiments in social psychology, but when they're exposed to them.
If you can get a long way from the anchor, it's not an anchor anymore, right? I mean,
let's call it anchorish.
Anchorish.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, the other way to put it is simply that those who appear to be consistent are those who have managed to control their environmental influences. My father is of someone who is profoundly consistent, and that's because he lives his life in a band that narrow, right? He has succeeded in conquering all sources of inconsistency, so that's, put that way, my father is no more a single person than the rest of us. He's just sort of honorary enough to have blocked out all of the contrary influences.
Yeah, maybe. And I think that also raises a very interesting question, which is it better to be a single person? It is unsettling to think that we aren't a single person, but it may also be the healthiest way to be and the happiest way to be. So yes, you're being buffeted by the fact that there's litter here or a broken window there or the wall happens to be painted pink, but maybe that's okay. It might actually be better to be that way than to be narrow and rigid and to try and fight all of these effects. Some of them you can harness in ways that I think make a lot of sense. It's cost-free to change the way we name our hurricanes. You can attract over a decade more than $1 billion in aid, or almost $1 billion in aid more, just by doing that. So why not do it? But as it applies to us as individuals, I think sometimes it's okay to let the world shape us just a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
Yep,
Some
yep.
questions. Questions for Adam. I'll let you run the show.
All right. Yeah, over there. Yes.
I was wondering, you were talking about how, I guess how race affects how people perceive. Does language, like the type of words people use, also affect? Would you say that it would also affect people's decision? Like if I were to say do not instead of don't, would that affect?
Yes, absolutely. Language is critical in all sorts of ways. There are a lot of great books about the effects of language on cognition. There's a lot of fantastic research. We know, for example, that in certain languages the word bridge happens to be a masculine word. In Spanish it's a masculine word. In German it's a feminine word. And so when you ask people to describe a bridge, they will describe it consistently with that. So if they happen to speak German, they will say that a bridge, because it's a feminine word in German, they'll say a bridge is beautiful and elegant. In Spanish, you say describe a bridge. If they happen to speak Spanish, they'll say the bridge is sturdy and strong and robust. So, I mean, that's one example of hundreds. It's a really fascinating area of study, and absolutely it applies to race, it applies to bridges, it applies to all sorts of stuff. No, absolutely not. I think I wouldn't want to be criticizing American jurisprudence or any one particular kind of jurisprudence or legal system, but I do think that that may have been the right outcome and the fair outcome in every case. I wouldn't want to comment on any one particular case, but I still think there are effects that nudge us one way or the other, just gently. And whether you want to say that the entire system is unfair, I think sometimes that's an overstatement. But yeah, right, exactly. I'd hope not. But certainly these effects in some cases, if you look at the aggregate, if the fact that you happen to look more typically one way or another way, and that can change in the aggregate outcomes, it suggests there's some degree of unfairness. And maybe not in the particular cases that you're involved in, but I think it's hard to argue that the system is perfectly fair if that's the case. Yeah, sure. So I talk about Sapir or Sapir and the theory there, the linguistic relativity hypothesis, which he and Benjamin Whorf talked about. The idea there is that our whole cognitive universe, the way you think about the world, is shaped entirely by your language. A very strong version of that hypothesis is that the only way you can perceive the world is through the lens of your language. And I think the very strong version of that has been, I don't know if disproven is the right word, but it's out of favor at the moment. People don't think it's an accurate way of describing the way we see the world. Having said that, the example with the bridges that I described, it's impossible to deny that our language shapes us to some extent. The question is just to what extent. And I think perhaps the strong version of their hypothesis, which is now 70 or 80 years old, is too strong. It's an overstatement. Yeah, so the question was, have these effects changed across time? So you can look across cultures geographically, you can also look across time. A lot of effects change across time. So the most obvious case is the fact that our social mores have changed. The moral code that we live by isn't the same moral code. We can see what's going on in the Supreme Court at the moment. As those mores change, as our approach to all sorts of social issues changes, the way we think and feel and behave changes as well. So some of these effects are very culture bound, not just geographically, but also bound in time. So the answer is yes. I think a lot of the effects that psychologists were interested in back then are not quite the same now. They've either changed or they don't exist. A lot of the explicit racism effects that psychologists were interested in would not be the same today. That's not to say that there is no racism. It's just in a very different form today. And so we study it in very different ways from how psychologists might have studied it 20, 30, 70, 100 years ago. Yeah, so I wrestled with that question when I wrote the book because I wrote it for two reasons. The primary reason was I thought the effects were interesting and people should know about them, and I wanted to share them because that's why I was interested in psychology from the beginning. But the second part is, what should we do about this and what are we doing about it? I think the book would have been a much longer book if I'd discussed all of that at length. I didn't go into the hurricane naming and how we could attract more hurricane aid in the book, for example. But to some extent I do discuss it in the book. Where there are obvious cases, I talk about it. And a lot of the anecdotes are cases where these effects have been harnessed either for the good or unfortunately for the bad. So I talk about the one case of a school where kids were split into classes. This is a very, very well-known effect in social psychology, where they were split into classes. They were randomly selected after they took a quiz. Some of them were put into a class and they were called academic bloomers. And the teachers were told in the next year these students will bloom, they'll do fantastically well. And the other kids were just put in a standard class. Now these kids were no different. They were just randomly selected. They had the same test scores on average. And yet after a year, with the teachers having expected that sort of outcome from them, the teachers perceived great promise, treated them differently, and after that year they had 10 to 15 points IQ gap over these other kids. So these effects are very, very powerful, and sometimes in demonstrating them you actually have to use them in some context, and that's a great example of that. I think the thing that always amazes me is how many corporations use all sorts of tactics, some of them effective and some, according to science and psychology, less effective, but how they come to them without even consulting science. So they have intuitions about how things should be done, and very often they're very sharp intuitions. They know what they're doing. They've gleaned this information from watching people interact with whatever kind of business it is. Steve Jobs is a classic case. He didn't believe in market research. So he didn't believe that there should be any research at all. And if you've read Walter Isaacson's biography, he talks about this at length. And he had such crisp intuitions and remarkable intuitions that he was able to divine what it took a lot of psychologists and experts reams and reams of data to understand. So some companies are using these effects. Are you looking for specific examples, or you just want me to say, yes, this is happening?
Do you see this in cigarette companies or toy companies, or who's doing this right, or who's doing this wrong, however you may view the product?
The best players or the biggest players in almost any market are large enough that they often are doing a lot of this stuff right, or at least they are doing things with some rhyme and reason behind what they're doing. They're not always right necessarily. Cigarette companies have the advantage of nicotine, which helps. So you don't have to be a phenomenal marketer, although you do have to compete with other cigarette companies. But to enlarge the size of the market is not that tricky with cigarettes, obviously. But I'm always surprised at how many companies do this stuff. You ask them questions and say things like, so how did you decide to do that? And they say, well, no, it just seemed like the right thing to do. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm Australian. I'll take it. I was born in South Africa, so it's sort of an Australian-South African combination, which I think you add 1 and 2 and you get British. We'll take British. So accents, I guess, are one factor. I didn't touch on that in the book. I only had 9 chapters. But chapter 10 might have been on that. Yeah, Lou.
What about sort of competing influences? I'm thinking about the sort of a joke, but you got to the wealthiest people, you knew they're the average initial, and they would be the people. It was an assumption, obviously, that the wealthiest people would give the most.
Right.
And what if they were living in this beautiful pink environment somewhere, and they were just not really moved to do something? They were so tranquil. Just as an example, like does that ever occur? Do you see any evidence that one thing would be stronger than another, and in terms of influences?
Yeah, so the question was, are there competing influences, and when there are, what happens? How do you decide which influence is going to trump the other? And that's a constant question, because a lot of the studies that we run and a lot of the evidence comes from these very distilled lab studies where you pick out just the one thing you want to focus on, and then when you take it and apply it to the real world, it's obviously much more complex. So when we went to people and said, we asked Princeton students how much they think the stock would appreciate when it had a simple name, and they said it was going to go up 40%. People didn't really care. But when you look at the real markets and you find that these effects still exist in the markets with all the noise and the other stuff going on, they're obviously much more moved by that. But the question of what happens when you take these effects to the real world when you have competing influences is an important one. And I think that's why we run field studies. But more than that, it depends on the effect. There are these competing effects, and so when you describe an effect in isolation, you always have to think about what the other things are that are going on around it, whether they might be magnifying it or sometimes dampening it. And obviously, on a case-by-case basis, sometimes that's significant and very important. So I'll just give a quick example. From some of my research, I study fluency and the ease with which we can process information. And people like stuff that's fluent, that's easy to process. And they like stocks that are fluent, and they like people who have fluent names, and so on and so forth. But also, when you make something disfluent, they process that information more deeply, because disfluency signals to them that they haven't got enough information yet to make to draw a good conclusion. And so making things slightly more difficult, although that dampens how they feel about it, that tamps down their positivity, is likely to make them think harder about it, and so that they can counteract each other. So when do you make something fluent and when do you make it disfluent is a very important practical question, and it does depend on the context.
Yeah. Is there a category of these effects that go away when you tell people about them?
Yeah, actually a lot of them. A lot of them in some contexts. So if you say to someone, fluency is a great example. If you say to someone, this is going to be very difficult, good luck. Or you'll notice that this font, a lot of the times we manipulate fluency with font. So we'll present something in a font that's slightly more difficult to read, and I talk about this in the book. And if you make it too difficult, so it's obvious, people say, what the hell were they thinking? Why present it this way? And then it doesn't have its effects. So we find, for example, if you ask people about a moral transgression, is it okay, say that these are all horrific. Let me try and think of one that's slightly less horrific. So if you're, they're all horrific. But imagine a moral transgression.
Who's the one about the dog?
Okay, the dog's okay. So that's the one I was leaning towards. I can't believe I said it's okay. Imagine your dog has died, which is very sad, and you decide that you're curious about the taste of dog meat. So you want to cook and eat the dog. Is that okay? Now, if you present it in a font that's fluent, people say, no, that's not okay. But if you present it in a font that's disfluent, they say, that is terrible. They think it's way worse. And what they do is they confuse this feeling of negativity they get from processing the disfluent font for a sense that the transgression is making them feel uneasy and therefore it's even worse. But if you say to them, sorry, we ran out of printer toner and that's why you can't read the questions, then they do discount that. They try, as I mentioned before, they try to partial it out and make their decisions without the influence of that effect.
Yeah.
And sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't.
So in writing this book about many of these effects, you are helping to destroy them. Is there a name for that category of psychology book that reverses the phenomenon as it describes it?
Yeah, self-defeating. The self-defeating book. Now that you've all read the book or will read the book, none of these effects exist anymore. As each page that you read makes the previous page irrelevant.
That's right.
So enjoy.
Maybe one or two more?
One or two more? Yeah.
Do you think that being very aware of situational factors can help people make better decisions, or do you think it can contribute to a learned helplessness of I'm totally the situations control me?
Yeah. So the question was, is it a good thing to know? Are you making better decisions for knowing these effects, or do they just make you? Or do you become helpless? Do you recognize that these effects are driving you and you throw your hands up in the air and it's a terrible thing? And I think that's largely a personality question. So some people will respond by saying, this is terrible, I can't believe all of this is happening to me. I think that's an extreme reaction. Other people are mindful of it. And it's funny when I talk to people about the book, some people say, oh, you've just told me about this thing, I'm going to go and run my life this way. I don't really do that. Maybe I should be more careful about these effects, but I don't. I don't do much differently because I've read about them. And so I think it's just a question of the personality of each person. There isn't one way to deal with them.
But wait, this brings up a really interesting question, which is, so we know that there is a dark side to the fact that as human beings we are largely oblivious to the extent to which we're subtly being shaped and influenced by these environmental forces. What's the good part of that? Surely there's a reason why we have, or at least a set of reasons why it's probably good to be oblivious to those factors.
Yeah, so one explanation or one answer to that is the fact that we still exist despite them, despite all these strange biases, suggests that a lot of them are probably adaptive. So it makes sense. We like things we like food that is a certain color. We don't like purple food, for example. There's a good reason. If you were walking around and foraging and you found a purple food, it probably wasn't very good for you. And over time, we learned that information and it was embedded somehow across an evolutionary timescale. And the argument is that a lot of these effects hold for that reason. And the same is true, for example, with people who wear red shirts. Apparently the color red makes you more attractive, as I said earlier. It's possible that people who could detect that and respond to that were responding to someone who was more interested in mating, and therefore their genes were more likely to carry on, and so on. So I think obeying some of these effects either is still helpful today, or at least on an evolutionary timescale was once a very helpful approach and an adaptive approach. And so that's the lighter side, I guess.
I was going to say something slightly different, which is maybe there's a sense in which our obliviousness is what allows us to do great things, right?
Yeah, I think to some extent that's true. I think we'd be paralyzed otherwise. And some of these things lead us in serendipitous directions, and they help us do great things. I absolutely believe that. So some of these effects, if we try to counteract them, I think we're preventing some great outcomes from emerging. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.